The Department of Education is in danger. Some people are talking about cutting it altogether. Is that a good idea? Here to help us understand is David Randall. He's the director of research at the National Association of Scholars. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Sure. So I think some are fantasizing about Elon Musk taking one of his famous flamethrowers and standing outside of the Department of Education and maniacally laughing as employees are escorted out as he takes a metaphorical flamethrower to the whole place. But, I've been covering DC for a while. I suspect it's not that easy. You and your organization released a lengthy, very thorough report on what does it actually look like to make cuts and reformations in the federal education space. So let me ask you, what does the landscape look like for Trump as this idea of reforming the Department of Education actually goes into reality?
I want to look ahead, not just for what's done under President Trump, but to make sure that the reforms of the education department endure, even if a president with different priorities assumes power in Washington. That means that executive orders are wonderful, but if you don't get rid of the underlying statute law, the education department could spring back to life as horrible as ever. So our report focuses on a variety of reforms, but it includes recommendations for the statutory reforms. You need to make sure that everything that is done wonderfully by Elon Musk and company now endures into beyond just one or even two administrations.
Right. So lay out, I think the average American has their own idea of what the Department of Education may be doing wrong. I think there's questions about discrimination. There's, questions about waste and abuse and why all this money goes all the way to DC just to be sent back to the states to spend. So what are some of those big, what are the line items, legislation that are going to make the biggest impact so that whatever Trump reforms are done in this Trump administration actually live beyond him?
The education department has four big spending areas, and that's Title I spending for disadvantaged school districts, special education funding for handicapped children, Pell Grants providing money for disadvantaged students, and then student loans for every college student who applies for them. There's then dozens and dozens of smaller programs, which, only billions and billions of dollars, but much less than the big four. But the thing is that bound up with that, the education department has this massive regulatory labyrinth, which subordinates all the, school districts and states to the education department in Washington. And most to the point, this weaponized use of civil rights law, above all, to impose this radical political agenda on the states, the school districts, on America. What the Trump administration has done in terms of getting rid of DEI already is wonderful, although there are some deeper changes that need to be made, like getting rid of disparate impact theory, full court. You also need to have massive financial reform, as they are contemplating, to make sure you can't use, this weaponization of civil rights law as a hammer blow to all the education departments and colleges. And then, as I say, you need to make that endure by the statutory reform that will make sure that the education department will never have that leverage over America's schools again.
Right. So I think this is a really important point. And I'm glad we have you on, because I don't hear anyone really talking about this, which is you can cut spending all you want. And I think a lot of Americans are cheering on the cutting of wasteful spending. But agencies don't just spend money. Actually, the main thing they do is make rules, and they make a lot of rules, and they make them almost every day. And you can cut funding for grants and for different employees, but those rules could still be on the books. And that doesn't even address maybe the laws that are written that gave life to those rules. And so I really think a lot of Americans would be amazed to know the wide, the authority and the discretion that these agencies have to make new rules that basically act as laws. For example, during the Biden administration, the Department of Education reinterpreted longstanding Title IX and how it was read. And they just redefined what the words in Title IX meant to suit a sort of political agenda. And and they just did it. And that shows you what they are capable of. And so, do you think that's a clear picture? Of course, cutting spending is clear, but what are those regulations? What does it look like to rewrite those regulations? Is that possible? Because it's such a long process to get new regulations. Is it unreasonable to think that 4 years of this administration is long enough to really do away with all these rules and things that have built up over decades?
You need 20 years. It's going to need President Trump and, a President Vance and a President DeSantis, just to idly pick two names following up. You can start immediately by saying you cannot use dear colleague letters to enforce major policy changes, which is this great abuse from the Obama years onwards. To say that you cannot use case resolutions to enforce massive policy. And what this means is the education department, it threatens a university or a school with, legal action. The school or university, often quite voluntarily, says, okay, we will make a massive local, diversity, repression and discrimination bureaucracy, and that will satisfy you. And the education department says yes. And then every other university or school district in the country says, oh, we better do this to be on the right side of the education department. It's all technically legal and it's all technically doesn't require statute, but it's obviously the education department usurping the role of Congress. And I might say creating what is now at least as dangerous as the education department's bureaucracy, all these distributed bureaucracies of discriminatory and repressive activists in every local education administration in the country.
Yeah. So just to go back to what you said at first, so it's clear normally agencies like the Department of Education have to go through a lengthy rulemaking process with comment. It can take years. And then once that, regulation goes on the books, Congress has a period of time where they can actually repeal it. And there's a whole long process. But of late, agencies have taken more and more liberty to, instead of go through that process, just basically send out a memo and say, here's the new law of the land. And to circumvent that entire process, you can call it, sometimes a dear colleague letter. Sometimes it can even just be a press release. I've seen it. It's really just, they send out a press release and everybody gets the memo and they act accordingly, and it circumvents the whole rulemaking process. Let me ask you, this is very complex. Obviously, I don't fully understand it. And I don't think most Americans don't. And that's just part of the problem probably. But let's say that, Musk has his dream come true and the entire agency is just absolutely eliminated overnight. No more Department of Education, including a lot of that spending that, you've laid out as important. And what happens next? Is it possible to resurrect that department? Are those rules still on the books? What is the post no Department of Education future look like in this administration if that happens?
Well, one thing we're afraid of is that the Department of Education will be eliminated in name only, because there is statutory support for each of the individual programs. So what if each individual program continues unreformed in the Department of Health and Human Services, in the Department of Defense, in the Department of State, in the Department of Interior? That may not benefit the American people. So just distributing the programs to other departments, we are afraid of declaring victory when victory hasn't been won. Beyond that, there is, as I say, just the question that they can come back to life. And, granted, they will be weakened. They'll need to start up again, but it is possible, even say there are dragon's teeth sown in the ground. The bureaucracies can rise even from being razed to the ground because they have very, very sturdy roots underground. And you need to pull out each of those weeds individually and carefully, or you're just going to have to fight the same battle again.
So, let me ask you, just, I want to pivot a little bit to the health of children, because I think it's funny that in all the debate about Department of Education, we don't actually spend a lot of time asking, are children better off? Because this hundreds of billions of dollar agency exists. During COVID, there was a lot of politicization, a lot of questioning about whether the Department of Education did what was right for children. There's a lot of questions about, school lunches and their lack of health, and RFK has been talking a lot about that. So I think there's fresh light on is the federal bureaucracy set up for the flourishing and the health of children, this increasing push towards screen times and then doing things on iPads. I mean, I think we're a little beyond the scope of your report at this point, but I'd love to give you an opportunity to speak to that issue.
We actually do have a highly technical section of the report. The education department is supposed to provide information about how effective its programs are. And if you dig into it, they never provide measures which actually give you a sense of return on investment. And they scarcely ever have a, efficiency report on the bureaucracies. Basically, we discovered what Elon Musk discovered. They're utterly irresponsible about providing policymakers or the public the information that can render them truly accountable and that can allow the American people to judge whether they're doing what they do well. And I guess you should say the question isn't whether they're doing good, but whether they're doing good that's worth the money. And look, if you throw $80 billion at, education, will something good happen? Sure. Will it be worth $80 billion? Maybe. Would it make sense to actually have really good studies that aren't just qualitative or based upon some subjective measure that's basically a bunch of self-interested experts saying, yeah, we think this works. So if you're going to be having a bureaucratic program at all, there are some highly technical measures of efficiency which ought to be installed, well, frankly, not just in the education department, but throughout the U.S. government, so that everyone can know either that the education department knows how effective the money is, or so that they say, frankly, we're just throwing money at the problem. We hope it's good in its effects.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research, I'm sure you know better than I, that throwing money at it, you can throw a lot of money at it. And if you do it the wrong way, it makes absolutely no difference. And we've seen that research. I mean, I know that there are things that can be done that are helpful and improve outcomes, but it's possible to spend a lot of money on education and waste a lot of money along the way. And so, I think for the last question, last word, maybe I'm old fashioned, maybe I'm a normal guy, but I thought the states were supposed to handle education. David, am I just a simple minded fool who is wondering why don't the states just pay for this stuff? We end all this federal programs and let them handle it. They know their kids better. I mean, their kids, very different populations. I mean, urban population in Southeast U.S. is very different from urban population in, Seattle. I mean, why don't the states just handle this like the old days? What am I missing? Am I a fool here?
Because the states think of it as free money. And who's going to turn down free money? And the school districts likewise. And in effect, ultimately, the federal government is bigger. It can borrow at a lower rate of interest. And frankly, because we have a dominant position in the world economy, some amount of what we borrow is effectively paid for by foreigners who prop up a dollar. So in some sense, what we're saying is the rest of the world should help us to spend inefficiently on our own education system. And much as I enjoy exploiting the credulity of people abroad, this probably isn't a good thing for America to do. There is also the question. It's a question of state responsibility. It's a question of state power, and it's a question of state freedom. And that is, I think, the most important point. It's tough for states not to get free money, but the states are supposed to be free and equal partners in our republic, our federal republic, and getting rid of all these strings that make us all, but the states in particular, prisoners of the federal government. Each little bureaucratic program, each little bureaucratic regulation, each of those eats out and hollows away the liberty we share, as individuals, as citizens of the state, and as citizens of the federal.
Well, borrowing money does give us a little free money, but I think the joke's on us now because interest payments on the national debt are among our biggest expenses. Soon will be our largest federal expense. And I'm not sure what we have to show for it, at least in the realm of education. David, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.